Okay, all right, welcome everybody. My great pleasure to welcome Dragan Gašević. Dragan is well known to all of us, I suspect. He's really one of the leading people in the learning analytics field, helped to co-found it, and of course was a co-author in the book of a chapter that was exploring the relationship of learning analytics for designing feedback for impact. So Dragan, great to have you here to help kick this off, and really looking forward to hearing your thoughts.
Yeah, thanks very much, Simon, and thanks for the chance to talk about the connections between learning analytics and feedback. I'm gonna very kind of loosely build on the chapter that I had a pleasure to publish with Tracy and Michael last year. The whole point basically will be around the use of learning analytics and the connections for feedback, what we see so far, what are the kind of emerging good pieces of work that I think are very promising to pay attention to, and what are the potential promises as well that we can pay attention to as we are going forward. I think one of the kind of key points that we always want to emphasize in learning analytics since the early days was always kind of to have this more kind of a holistic approach to learning analytics, where the idea was on the empowerment of learners and educators, rather than basically trying to replace them or trying to do something much different. Rather, the field of learning analytics always had this kind of approach to holistic idea of learning, and a holistic approach to learning analytics, where basically kind of the complexity of the systems that are related are accounted for. Obviously, one of the main motivations for the emergence of the field of learning analytics were some of the trends that are happening in primarily higher education, but education broader. And that's a kind of a need to always support more and more learners. At the same time, and we know that for very good, well, now in Australia as well, for less money. And so that basically in many cases, people were thinking, well, maybe technology can help us to address and mitigate some of these things. I'm not saying technology is helping us to mitigate some of these things, but what we basically are dealing is that kind of these feedback loops that exist between students and instructors or educator are often missing when we are introducing extra technology or when we are increasing the numbers. And even if they are not missing, they're kind of becoming weaker and weaker, and becomes really kind of difficult to read your room. Like even for me, I'm just looking at my screen at the moment. I'm not really able to read my lecture room, if you wish, at this very moment, as I'm kind of using this piece of technology. So then the key question becomes is basically how analytics can be leveraged in that process. Well, we always kind of knew that the moment you introduce web-based technologies, we are always kind of creating these like digital footprints. And so how that is happening, basically in many of these cases, we have some of the main learning environments, like learning management systems, Moodle, Desire2Learn, or whatever other environment they might have. And also historic, even longer type of environment that has been around is student information systems, where a range of socioeconomic and demographic data have been stored. And then over time, we kind of started introducing a range of other technologies that are promoting kind of more social interaction, development of some of these networking skills, leveraging of the resources that are out there, and building information seeking skills, promoting reflective practice to blogging, using lots of interactive media or different types of peer-to-peer interaction environments. And obviously more recently, even different types of physiological data. And then the key thing with all these technologies is that we are kind of creating these digital footprints, and the kind of the premise of learning analytics that we can exploit these digital footprints so that we can provide feedback for learners and educators. And earlier this morning, when I was reflecting that I had this slide, I actually realized this has been the slide I've been running for almost now full 13 years. And basically kind of the whole concept of learning analytics, and many people who were involved into different aspects of it were kind of trying to think about some of these things. So then the question becomes is how we are tracking with that, and especially kind of in the early days. And in the rest of kind of the talk, I'm going to first initially kind of focus on some of these kind of more data focused approaches. Then I'm going to discuss a little bit about the different types of approaches that are kind of very promising and that are connecting learning analytics with the literature on feedback, then also the kind of how learning analytics can help us with feedback and the measurement of that feedback, and then what are the opportunities as we are going forward. So obviously, early days of learning analytics really saw dashboards as the primary thing for feedback in learning analytics. And those are kind of relatively simple. I'd say basically what is easy to collect is what is easy to visualize. And in many cases, it would be basically kind of different types of activities that students are doing, and then comparisons. How many activities I had in comparison to my classmates, or when did I see certain pages and how that compares to my classmates, what grades did I get and how that compares to my classmates. So that's basically one of the typical examples. Some try to use a little bit more kind of data mining technologies and try to develop predictive models that are signaling to the students whether students are basically potentially at risk of completing a course. And that basically was the whole idea of the system called Course Signals that was developed at Purdue University. And then almost a decade ago, they kind of tested this system where they basically were showing the students some of these signals. And they basically showed that a cohort of the students who had at least one unit or a course with Course Signals had a far greater retention rate than those who were not in the Course Signals. I'm not going to go into the other debate. It was related to kind of the validity, some of these findings or methodological kind of consequences, but they basically kind of use this as a kind of a really potentially good promise for learning analytics. However, when they actually, after a couple of years of the use of this system, started to scratch the surface, and they kind of wanted to see the extent to which this was an effective way to also promote good feedback to students, they really realized that they really didn't increase the quality of feedback that was provided to students. What basically they saw is in many cases, they were just trying to kind of provide a little bit of motivational messages to students and increase the frequency of that feedback, but without really offering much kind of guidance in terms of what would be useful that students work on for the next task, or what are the potential limitations, and in a way that it can call students as well to open that dialogue between the educators and students in a way that feedback can be leveraged as a point of really improvement of learning strategies that students are taking. And so what we also see as we were going forward with kind of dashboards is that kind of the key messages that really kind of dashboards could be harmful. And so a study at the University of Michigan basically had a semester-long course with science students, and they measured their intrinsic motivation and compared that intrinsic motivation to students who were not exposed to that condition. And they found this basically that introduction of learning analytics dashboards that are comparing students with the class average or some of these social norms were basically associated with lower intrinsic motivation. A randomized controlled trial there was at Stanford University where they basically exposed about 30 years worth of data about students' engagement in different courses. So that means really the distribution of the grades for every course they had, and also self-reported measures about the amount of time students spent and so on, demonstrated that a group of students who were strongly encouraged to use this dashboard versus the group who was only informed about the presence of dashboard had a significantly lower GPA over the course of the introduction of this dashboard, yet much stronger use of this dashboard. Another point was basically with respect to kind of that potential harmful effect as well, is we had a also smaller scale randomized controlled trial in which we kind of used think alouds and asked students to look one of these typical dashboards that I showed in my first screen when I started talking about dashboards. And what we basically kind of found is that students really kind of identified the dashboards offer very little guidance with respect to what learning strategies they could take and how they can improve potentially their approach to learning. And often they were associated with negative emotions. Not obviously all negative emotions are kind of deactivating. Some of them can be also activating, but this was really kind of the key point of what we found about the use of dashboards. And so the question becomes really, can we call dashboards at all feedback? And I'd argue that perhaps even if we call them, I'd basically call them very poor feedback. And one of the key points there is that why I'm kind of building this argument and why I'm fairly negative about the current generation of dashboards, not dashboards in general, is that basically when we kind of analyze the literature, empirical literature on learning analytics dashboards, and we had a systematic review on that published this year, but it was completed 2 years ago. And we used the Winnie-Hadwin model of self-regulated learning to analyze the indicators that dashboards were using to analyze many different kind of bits that were shown there. What we found is basically not a single one of them basically had anything to do with learning strategies, not in terms of offering anything about students' own learning, nor what other learners are doing. And that's really kind of bit kind of concerning if we are actually trying to offer any bit of feedback to learners. There was another, a bit even additionally concerning bit that we found is that less than, I think, 10% of these dashboards had any conceptual or theoretical model that was grounded in the educational literature that drove their development. In a way, what we basically kind of recommended as a consequence of this is that we really have to kind of abandon some of these preconceived design decisions. And I think some of these critical design decisions are really, well, not really quite even design, it's more like implicit design. Why don't we kind of show or visualize something that is relatively easy to visualize? And as a response to this, we really kind of indicated that rather than us talking about dashboards in learning analytics, we should really be focusing much more on user-centered learning analytics systems. And these systems need to be built on what we already know about learning and teaching and education and theoretical accounts. They need to be also built on solid grounds that are available in the literature on design, particular more recent kind of also uptake on human-centered design and the work that Simon is doing, as well as kind of the emphasis on co-design. Obviously, I think for any effective learner-centered dashboards, we really have to account for literature and feedback and what are the kind of existing trends in the feedback literature, in particular, the emphasis on feedback literacy, the emphasis on dialogic feedback, as well as kind of the emphasis on the learners as agents and the kind of the need for them to be able to make sense of that information that is available in dashboards and then be able to change their future strategies and the approach to overall learning. And clearly we need to be very rigorous how we are evaluating our approaches to these kind of user-centered learning analytics systems. So this is kind of my usual rant about dashboards, and I'm going to talk a little bit now about approaches that are, I think, interesting. That are really kind of getting learning analytics much closer to the literature on feedback. And I'm going to really talk about two particular examples. The first one is, and I think some of the people as well in the room are familiar with the work of Abelardo Pardo. Abelardo Pardo built on the, I think, fairly seminal work by Phil Winnie and Deb Butler from 1995 to propose basically a concept in which learners and other more competent others, if you wish, are involved into the process of the feedback, whereby basically agent B on this screen you can see is more kind of a cognitive system as conceptualizing the original Butler-Winnie paper, and on the right, and then on the other side is the agent agent A, who basically is empowered with analytics. And so the kind of the whole idea is that we are aiming with this process to kind of collect multimodal evidence, which is kind of a range of different types of data, whether they are kind of different clicks from the learning management systems, or even more kind of nuanced types of text that students are potentially generating, or even some more sophisticated bits and pieces that are potentially coming from the classroom interactions that are using maybe even a bit more invasive technologies. Then the idea is to kind of leverage some of these measures and then inform potentially certain and compare it against the tasks that students are having, and then eventually deliver information to the students. So this whole kind of approach was developed in parallel with the work on the system that several of us across several Australian universities worked on, and that's basically a system called OnTask. And the whole idea of the OnTask was, rather than to really kind of use the dashboards and show them to the students, the idea was always to empower. And I think the model also, Clavalardo, is really on the empowerment of the teacher or the educator to be able to exploit learning analytics and then create certain rules. And these rules could be, for example, defined based on, for example, any statistic, if you wish, or variable that is relevant for any given task for learners. This is an example that we use in one of our papers, and it's basically where students are divided, for example, in quartiles, or for example, the activity that is related to, for example, some of the problem-solving assessments that students had, but at the same time, similar rules could be developed as well for any kind of activities that are coming from their overall kind of activities that are kind of measuring how much they really interact with relevant pieces of information, whether that information is video or textual form. And so this case is basically kind of providing rules that are kind of entering different snippets of text or feedback, if you wish, to the learners for any given task based on, for example, the quartile of their activity. It doesn't have to be quartile. These rules can be defined in any custom way as the educator may desire. But then, while the educator is empowered by basically leveraging the data to create some of these rules, then there is an algorithm that can then match the student's own data with these rules and then compile potentially a feedback that is eventually generated for the learner in this form. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the effectiveness of this approach in a few moments, when I'm talking a little bit about the use of learning analytics to measure the impact of feedback. But while this approach I really kind of like in a way that is effective, it kind of also resulted in a very practical solution, also builds upon some of my favorite work in educational psychology. There's also kind of the thing that potentially needs to be aligned in this work with more kind of modern approaches in thinking about feedback, and that's the emphasis on dialogic feedback. This approach is still kind of more emphasizing more transmissive approaches. I think it's not really kind of dismissive of dialogic approaches to feedback, but at the same time, it could actually be improved and thought through in such way that kind of that dialogic feedback is also more explicitly articulated in model and better promoted in that sense. So having spoken about kind of that emphasis on dialogic feedback, there's a more kind of recent work that was done and led by Erkan Ir, who is a Marie Curie fellow in Valladolid in Spain, co-supervised with Yanis Dimitridis and myself. And Erkan's work really is kind of building on this whole premise of dialogic peer feedback. And also in composing his theoretical foundation for this approach, he built on the literature on socially shared regulated learning and the model that Sana Yavela and Allison have been proposed almost a decade ago now. And that is kind of closely related to also the notions of really peers helping each other regulate each other's learning, where peers are really kind of equals, to the notions of co-regulated learning, where the learners are actually interacting with somebody who is a bit more capable other with respect to the particular tasks and the activities that they are working on. And then obviously self-regulated learning and the notions that are kind of derived from Hadwin and winning model of self-regulated learning. That's basically one element of it. And the other element of this dialogic peer feedback is the emphasis also on scaffolding and support for that process. And that scaffolding comes more from the literature on computer-supported collaborative learning and the work of people such as Trent Fisher on script theory of collaborative learning, where basically a need to kind of offer students to develop their own scripts by initially kind of offering them certain kind of externally defined scripts for them to work on that. And the whole process of this dialogic peer feedback kind of starts from kind of negotiation and coordination of certain feedback provision, and that is more socially shared regulation activity, then dialogic interaction for uptake of that feedback, where we kind of have more kind of emphasis where you are giving that some feedback from a more competent other to kind of the level of translation of feedback into task progress, where the learners really are trying to now kind of make sense of that for themselves and improve potentially their learning strategies. And obviously in this entire process, we have learning analytics support, which is kind of really looking into the ways, what kind of standards learners are using, how they're monitoring their process, how they're evaluating against the standards they are using, and the extent to which they are adapting their learning strategies. This model has been a bit more operationalized now, where we are kind of seeing very kind of specific types of activities for any of these three key elements of the process, where planning and coordination of feedback activities kind of involving building consensus on the quality of the submitted work and planning feedback activities. And then within each of these kind of sub-dimensions, we also see the needs for a really very specific activities that can potentially be monitored with use of learning analytics, and additional kind of insight can be obtained in that process. So the whole model has been also supported with the environment synergy that Erkan developed, and nicely kind of supports all these kind of elements of the kind of assessment of peer work, as well as feedback provisioning, and kind of supporting all these three phases as learners are going. And the use of analytics is also nicely incorporated in this environment. Primarily, analytics in this case is really kind of, again, to support the educator, who is potentially guiding the process, helping students to go in this process, seeing the extent to which they are making certain contributions across all these different phases that are envisioned in the model, and also kind of helping students as well to see the extent to which students are, for example, adopting certain rubrics, the extent to which students are also able to reach consensus in some of these activities, and potentially identifying places where a potential consensus has not been reached, and how that consensus or how the instructor potentially can help them intervene in that process. Obviously, this is kind of, I think, relatively new work as well. I think there's lots of promise for use of learning analytics in this space, I think, which has kind of scratched the surface of the use of learning analytics. And we are running a number of different pilot studies. So if anybody's kind of interested, please let me know. And also Synergy Synergy environment is freely available. The website is listed here. So if you really want to kind of explore some of these promises. So those are some of the kind of interesting approaches. And I'm not really claiming that I kind of gave the overview of everything that is out there. But I think it's kind of something that is highlighting really interesting places where you could start. So in respect to kind of use of learning analytics to measure impact and the value of feedback, that's where I think some of the more kind of technical work in learning analytics and the use of more advanced machine learning and artificial intelligence techniques can be useful. I've been very fortunate to have like a group of very talented PhD students who worked on different approaches that are helping us to mine learning strategies, time management strategies, and the different processes of self-regulated learning from digital traces. And some of that work has been then really trying to identify how learners are potentially changing and adopting their learning strategies as they are going with their learning. But at the same time, also, we were able to see how implementation of certain feedback type of intervention is also influencing not only students' outcomes, but the whole process of their learning, because kind of our intention was always to influence with that feedback process. This is just one example of the findings of a study that was basically kind of done with the use of OnTask, which was initially used to administer feedback. And this is the administration of that feedback over the course of 3 years. So the first year had no personalized feedback with the use of OnTask. It had only a dashboard that I kind of heavily tried to debunk initially in my talk. Then the first year, we administered feedback only for the half of the semester, and then eventually feedback was administered for the entire semester on a weekly basis. And you can see that in early days, we had this yellow bar, which represented kind of highly selective and low engagement strategy that we identified was readily declining. While at the same time, this kind of intensive high engagement approach that students are using this violetish type of color is increasing, as well as the green color as well was increasing over time. So in a way, the use of learning analytics really can help us to measure potential effectiveness of a particular feedback. Similarly, we were also able to measure, for example, impact of feedback and different types of interventions that were helping even students to provide each other feedback in a form of a community inquiry, and help students then to see the extent to which we are helping students to develop, for example, collaborative problem solving skills over the course of time. So this was kind of really interesting, because we had not really kind of very kind of reductive kind of clickstreams data, but we used kind of students' online discussions, and we automatically analyze these online discussions for concepts that are coming from the model of communities of inquiry. And that model really kind of defines the concepts such as cognitive presence, social presence, and also the construct of teaching presence. And we kind of conceptualize collaborative problem solving composed of the social and cognitive domains, social and cognitive presence. And then once we have identified and coded these messages, then we applied something which is called epistemic network analysis. And based on the application of that epistemic network analysis, we could see the links between relevant codes that are coming from epistemic, from different codes that are representing cognitive social presence. But really, the whole target for us was in this latent variable space was to promote many more messages that are kind of related to integrations, which meant really synthesis of information and generation of promising hypotheses, and then resolving these in that kind of collaborative environment. And then on the right-hand side of your screen, we can see these kind of 4 different lines. They're all projecting the same variable space, or the similar kind of dimensions represented there, where you can see students tracked over the course of 4 weeks and in different, if you wish, feedback and instructional conditions, where basically initially this blue line didn't have any feedback, and they were pretty much at the kind of lower end of collaborative problem solving, while the other group of students had more kind of better, more advantageous role, if you wish, the green group, and they kind of improved. But once we actually improved that overall feedback for students, as well as help them to really use better standards as they were going forward, we can see then these 2 other lines represented with the purple color as well as with the red color, that students were actually almost much closer to the ideal line for us, where we wanted them to kind of start from integration to resolution. So this kind of really gives us some interesting hope that learning analytics can help us with the opportunities to measure students' progression, but at the same time to also think about the effectiveness of feedback and how learning analytics can potentially think about measurement of that effectiveness of feedback. So I'm going to talk now about some of the opportunities, and I'm going to really emphasize on this point that I think we need to potentially seize with the use of learning analytics. I think learning analytics really can be very helpful to help us to automatically analyze the quality of feedback that we are providing and receiving. That can, I think, and I argue that can also be helpful to develop our or everybody's, I think, feedback literacy. But that process really is not just about artificial intelligence. I think it's kind of really coming from these 3 components, and we really have to have clear pedagogical knowledge. I mentioned Erkan's model, and that model really builds on the script theory that is coming and heavily used in collaborative support, computer supported collaborative learning. And obviously we need to kind of incorporate some bits and pieces of content knowledge as well, if we want to kind of have a sensible conversation in certain environments. So what we have seen so far in some of this work is that learning analytics or some of these machine learning methods can really help us detect the use of good feedback practices in feedback. So we are really able to automatically analyze feedback that is provided to students or received and across different stakeholders with a pretty good accuracy. In this process, we use, for example, David Nichols' good feedback practices to automatically analyze messages. Similarly, we've been also able to show that we can automatically detect levels of feedback that is provided for students, whether we are talking about task level, process level, self-regulation, or self-feedback. In that sense, we are really kind of automatically able to identify these indicators, and these indicators then could be then fed back to those who are providing. If you wish, we can think of an environment which is kind of a Grammarly for feedback writing, but we can also think about more even less intrusive approaches to the use of that feedback. I think that's kind of up for really kind of thinking about some of these opportunities. There's even other ways how analytics can help us to think about the effective ways of feedback. So this is another piece of work that basically aimed to identify what kind of language is used by students and in a kind of human-human dialogue between students and instructors and students in terms of politeness and the extent to which that politeness also makes sense and make a potential difference in terms of the outcomes that students are achieving as well as they are feeding them to the next tasks. So what I'm really kind of hoping with this work, as I previously mentioned, but just kind of to emphasize it, that potentially analytics can really be used in this case to help us grow that feedback literacy. And I, in this stage, really predominantly gave the examples of the work that really was focusing on the analysis of the feedback provided, but at the same time, that feedback literacy analytics, so that we need to have the further uptake as well of that feedback that is provided and the extent to which different features of that feedback are actually influencing understanding, makes sense making, as well as update of that feedback in terms of the decisions that are informing future tasks that learners are taking. And the final thing, which is kind of my personal wishful thinking as well, is that in terms of that kind of generation of feedback as well, is, and especially if we are talking about kind of these future trends as well, where in the extent to which we can really kind of think about these hybrid AI and human systems, is the extent to which kind of the AI can help us generate some level of feedback and then engage into that dialogue as well with the learner, might be also an interesting kind of future trend that we may observe and we might be working as we are going forward. Just a few final remarks before I wrap up my talk and open for discussion. I really hope that through all these things, and this has been my kind of main motif about the use of really learning analytics, is that learning analytics is primarily about that learning and how that learning can benefit from learning analytics. So learning analytics and all these technical things are really just in function of us understanding better and advancing and enhancing learning. And therefore, I really also hope that then this message is that learning analytics is also about feedback, and that we need to really, if we are going to grow the field of learning analytics to be a very healthy space, we really need to emphasize and deeply engage with the literature of feedback and really critically examine the extent to which some of these benefits are really useful or really are good opportunities for us to explore, and one of them really we should not be even wasting all our time and thinking about what are those more constructive ways. I want to also emphasize another critical thing is that learning analytics is really not just about data science. It is the place where data science education and design should meet, and they meet more and more. But all these things that I so far discussed about use of feedback, really in many cases, while they engage in certain levels of design, I think the emphasis that Simon has been advocating for quite a long time needs to be even additionally taken upon. And that kind of emphasis of human-centered design, not only in terms of the design of these environments, but also in terms of the feedback, how we are co-constructing some of that feedback, how we are co-designing the environments as well as the opportunities, how we are co-designing even feedback itself, where everybody who is involved in that process becomes a partner rather than just a recipient, or rather than just somebody who is asked to provide that feedback. So I'm gonna close on that note and happy to open the conversation. Thank you for your attention.